All right, so I am going to be reading another set of materials. This is Unit 1, Day 7 and 8. This is what it looks like, titled The Transcontinental Railroad. I again will be reading the explores and the elaborates for this section. So, making the railroad possible. Beginning in the early 1870s, railroad construction in the United States increased dramatically. Prior to 1871, approximately 45,000 miles of track had been laid. Between 1871 and 1900, another 170,000 miles were added to the nation's growing railroad system. Much of the growth can be attributed to the building of the Transcontinental Railroads. Transcontinental means crossing the entire continent. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act, which authorized construction of a transcontinental railroad. Pacific Railway Act is a vocab term. This first railroad was completed on May 10th, 1869. So this is only 4 years after the end of the Civil War and before the end of Reconstruction. By 1900, 4 additional transcontinental railroads connected the eastern states with the Pacific coast. Without the assistance of the U.S. government, railroad construction between 1860 and 1900 would have been greatly curtailed. That means shortened. Building a railroad was an expensive venture. Private banks, fearing the railroad companies would need a long time to pay off their debts, were reluctant to loan money to the companies. To remedy the situation, that means to fix the situation, Congress provided assistance to the railroad companies in the form of land grants, vocab, shown in the map in the box. The land grant railroads receiving millions of acres of public land, that means land owned by the government, sold land to make money, build their railroads, and contributed to a more rapid settlement of the West. 4 or 5 transcontinental railroads were built with the assistance from the federal government through land grants. You're going to tell me now, you're going to describe 2 government actions that made the Transcontinental Railroad possible and why they were necessary. Next section, building the railroad. One key issue confronting industrialists was the quality of materials they could use to build a railroad. This issue was solved by Henry Bessemer's process for creating steel, one of the strongest metals available. The Bessemer process, vocab, was an extremely important invention because it helped make stronger rails for constructing the railroads and helped to make stronger metal machines and innovative architectural structures for skyscrapers. Skyscrapers are tall buildings, so like your regular buildings, 13 stories up, a skyscraper's 60, 50, 100. Context. Another issue faced by railroad builders was getting workers to complete the tremendous labor required. That means the large amount / the difficulty. In the article below, historian Gordon H. Chang discusses one important group of laborers. Between 1863 and 1869, as many as 20,000 Chinese workers helped build the treacherous western portion of the railroad. A winding ribbon of track known as the Central Pacific that began in Sacramento, that's at the top of California. At first, the Central Pacific Railroad's directors wanted a whites-only workforce. When not enough white men signed up, the railroad began hiring Chinese men for the back-breaking labor. These workers showed their mettle, that means their toughness, and sealed their legacy on the peaks of the Sierra Nevada. Many laborers at that time had assumed that Stanford and the railroad were daft for thinking they could link California with the East because an immense mountain range separated the state from Nevada and beyond. So pause. When it says Stanford, and you think, what do I know about Stanford? It's the college, Stanford University. Yes, those are the same people. So one of the people who owned the railroad, the railroad in the Pacific was It was Stanford. He is also one of the people that the University of Stanford is named after. Okay, sorry, going back on track. To get to the high Sierra, Chinese workers cut through dense forests, filled deep ravines, constructed long trestles, and built enormous retaining walls, some of which remain intact today. All the work was done by hand using carts, shovels, and picks, but no machinery. The Chinese workers were paid 30% to 50% less than their white counterparts and were given the most dangerous work. Note, you have a CFU. How did racism play a role in building of the railroad? The greatest challenge was to push the line through the Sierra summit. Solid granite peaks soared to 14,000 feet in elevation. That means the mountains were 14,000 feet high. The railroad bed snaked through the pass at more than 7,000 feet. The men who came from the humid South China labored through two of the worst winters on record, were surviving in caravans. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Surviving in caverns, that means caves, dug beneath the snow. CFU, what challenges did Chinese workers face in terms of physical geography? After the Sierra, Chinese workers faced the blistering heat of the Nevada and Utah deserts, yet they drove ahead at an astonishing rate. Astonishing means surprising. As they approached the meeting point with the Union Pacific, thousands of them laid down a phenomenal 10 miles of track in less than 24 hours, a record that has never been equaled. A Civil War officer who witnessed the drama declared that the Chinese were just like an army marching over the ground and leaving the track behind. And the source is called Remember the Chinese Immigrants Who Built America's First Transcontinental Railroad. Your question or your task is to describe the impact of Chinese laborers on building of the Transcontinental Railroad. All right, I'm going to my second to last reading, the impact of the railroad. David L. Phillips wrote an account of his trip to California in 1876. So this is after the Transcontinental Railroad has connected. Among other things, he was deeply impressed by California's railroad system. This passage is from Phillips' book, Letters from California, published in 1877, which again is when Reconstruction ended. In 1862, the people had no railroads. High-priced mail contractors and stage companies held carrying trade and passenger business of California, held the carrying trade and passenger businesses of California. Communications between the Pacific coast and the Middle and Atlantic states took place over land once every 2 months. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company made the trip via Panama in about the same time. The cost of transit from New York to San Francisco, so New York on the East Coast, San Francisco on the West, was about $300. This was the same as by stagecoach over land. California was poor agriculturally and in every other way except the mines. Today, it takes 6 days to travel overland from New York to San Francisco at the cost of $140, excluding board. Board means food, how much money you pay to eat. As a result, almost all the trade from Asia and the islands of the Pacific Ocean are now arriving at the docks of San Francisco. Most of it will pass overland to Chicago and New York by rail at a reduced rate of freight as well as time. The rates of freight means the amount being charged for to ship things. There you go. As I came here, I saw trainloads of tea from China and Japan on the way to Chicago and New York. For this, San Francisco's merchants and people can thank the energetic railroadmen of Sacramento. The Central Pacific Railroad runs from Redding in Northern California through the center of the state to Caliente. It is a distance of nearly 500 miles. This opens This opens up mainly the whole interior of the state to the hardy farmer, fruit grower, and lumbermen. Lumbermen are people who cut wood, chop wood for a living. It increases the value of the land more than sixfold, so more than 6 times. This 500-mile line in the very heart of the state is now open. It has not cost the state $1. Lying along each side of this line is a body of land 9 miles wide that amounts to 9,000 square miles, or 5,760 acres. Before the railroad was built, it was worth, on average, $1.25 per acre. Now everyone agrees its average value is $8 per acre. This means the railroad has increased the wealth of the state by $6.75 per acre. That is the sum equal to about 48,888,000. Add to this the value of the products, present or future, of 1/2 of the 5,760. Gotcha. 5 million. Okay. All right. So I read the initial number incorrectly. It is 5,760,000 acres of land. Nor is this all. The railroad company has opened other lines equal to 600 miles more. In doing so, it has added tens of millions to the permanent wealth of the state and infinitely to the comfort of the people. Nor does it stop here. The railroad will continue to build roads until it reaches every accessible portion of the state. It will thus open up highways for the products of the people to markets in all directions. You're going to summarize the changes that Phillips claims were brought about by the Transcontinental Railroad. All right. And I'll elaborate. The dark side of the railroad. Building the railroad required control of vast swaths of Western territory, which impacted some groups more than others. So you have a picture to look at. It says Indian land for sale. Get a home of your own, easy payments, fine lands in the West, perfect title, possession within 30 days, irrigable, which means you can put water systems on it. Irrigation is what gives us sewage systems. Grazing, there's land for cows to graze. Agricultural dry farming. You can farm things on that land. In 1910, the Department of the Interior sold under sealed bids allotted Indian land as follows. So then what you're seeing is sealed bids means they indicated the number or the amount of land that could be sold. All right, you're answering. According to this advertisement, who was negatively impacted by the construction of the railroad? How were they impacted? Final reading. Economic hard times spread throughout the nation in the 1870s. As revenues, that means profits, fell, American railroads searched for ways to cut costs. Pay cuts angered workers for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. They went on strike in 1877. Again, that's when Reconstruction ended. Violence soon broke out. At one point, President Rutherford B. Hayes sent federal forces to several locations to reopen the roads. The railroad strike of 1877 was one of the largest labor conflicts in American history. This passage is part of an article on the strikes from the St. Louis Dispatch dated July 24th, 1877. The CFU questions that you should be answering are: 1. How are the strikers protesting against the railroad companies? 2. What is the author warning the St. Louis strikers to do? The news from East St. Louis today is of an exciting and angry sort. Violence was used this morning in what could be called a railroad war. The strikers are not satisfied with stopping the freights. They have decided to seize and hold passenger trains coming into and out of the city until their demands are satisfied. An eastern-bound passenger train on the Vandalia was stopped by this morning at East St. Louis. A number of ladies aboard were greatly alarmed. After a short delay, the train was allowed to pass on its destination. The strikers do not plan to interfere with mail or government trains. At least, that is what they say this morning. Yet further reports show that one extreme act in violation of law and order is followed by another. A dispatch reporter from East St. Louis tells us that the United States troops under command of Jeff C. Davis were ordered into the city. Strikers switched them off from the main road to a sidetrack after they reached St. Louis. This is the first overt act against the United States authorities on the part of the strikers. The government is sure to see this and resent it. Just as a side note, Jefferson C. Davis, it was a major military leader in the Civil War. Okay. The riot in Pittsburgh has become as destructive and senseless as that of the recent Paris terrorists. It has destroyed a vast quantity of equipment and has prevented the Pennsylvania Railroad Company from being able to hire the same number of workers for a long time to come. In Baltimore, the strikers have exceeded every bound in their outrages. They have disabled the fire engines while at work. They have cut hose, attacked officers of the law, and acted as to destroy all sympathy for their side of the story. The strikers certainly have a case as strikers, but as desperados and murderers, so desperados are kind of like vigilantes or criminals, they have given up their right to merciful treatment. So they've given up their right to be treated kindly by people. Let those of St. Louis avoid the mistakes of their brethren of Baltimore and Pittsburgh. You're going to tell me how this article shows another negative impact of railroads on the United States. And there you have it. You will get the Homestead Act. Not today, I'm going home.